Hi there, welcome to this video where I'm going to tell you how to get blurred backgrounds in your wildlife images. You might have seen images like this one here where the background is completely out of focus, and it does make for a very striking image because you can really focus on the subject without being distracted by messy backgrounds. And so in this video I'm going to show you how to achieve that in your photographs. This video came about because I was left a super thanks by somebody called Tugnacious, so thank you Tugnacious for that super thanks. But he'd watched one of my very old videos that is over 4 years old, and when I reviewed that video I realised it was quite cringeworthy because the editing is awful and the presentation is less than great. So I decided I was going to remake it and hopefully help you to enjoy your photography. Let's start by looking at what difference an out of focus background makes to an image. So I'll put a photograph on the screen now where the background is a little bit messy. There's lots of twigs behind the bird, and this can just prove to be distracting. Now some people might say it shows the bird in its natural environment, and so they actually want this kind of shot, and this can be okay if that's what you're looking for. But sometimes I find these twigs behind the bird to be so distracting that I use the remove tool in Photoshop to actually take them out, and so it's not totally desirable. Now compare that to this image where the bird is on its perch but the background is completely thrown out of focus, so it's just one completely plain colour. And what this does is it really does make you focus on the bird because there's no distractions at all coming from the background. There are many factors involved in trying to get this out of focus background. If you're out in the field and haven't really got control of the conditions, this is going to be a lot more difficult. Absolutely not impossible, but knowing how to achieve this will really help when you get out into the wild. So I'm going to show you some controlled experiments here in the garden this morning to explain how you get that out of focus background. The key to getting out of focus backgrounds is knowing how to control your depth of field. Now this sounds a little bit technical, but I'm going to talk you through that in this video. But basically depth of field is how much of the image is acceptably sharp from front to back. And what you're trying to do is make that depth a lot smaller so you only get the front of the bird and the back of the bird in focus, and everything else becomes blurred. The first setting that we're going to look at that controls your depth of field is the aperture that you set your lens to. Now usually there's a dial on the front of the camera that controls the size of the aperture, but you might not have any idea what aperture actually is. So I'm going to show you on this lens what aperture actually means. If we look inside this lens here, you can see right in the middle there's a small hole, but I can make this hole bigger or smaller, and that is effectively what is called the aperture. Now at the moment we have a small aperture, and we can make that larger and we can make it smaller. Now one of the effects that this has is it lets more or less light in. Obviously the bigger the hole, the more light it's going to let into the camera, but it also makes the depth of field smaller or larger as well. So when you have a large hole, it actually creates a shallower depth of field, so less of the image is in focus. And when you've got a small hole like at the moment, then you've got a larger depth of field, so more of the image is in focus. So it's a little bit of a trade-off between what you want in focus and how much light you want to let into the camera. I've set up a demonstration just here with a model bird to my right about 20 centimeters in front of this fern, and then the camera's here at less than a meter away from the bird. Now what I've done is I've taken one photograph with the aperture set to f/25. Now a little bit counterintuitively, a large F number means a small aperture. Now there is a reason for this, but it's a little bit technical for this video, so you can go and look that up if you're really interested. What this has done is it's made the ferns really quite visible and in sharp focus, and by just making the aperture a lot wider, I think I've put it at f5.6, which is the largest that this lens will go to, then the ferns, even though they're not very far away, are thrown much more out of focus. Now they don't get completely blurred into absolutely nothing because they're still quite close to the bird itself, but it's a lot more pleasing. The next thing that affects how blurred the background is going to be is the focal length of the lens. At the moment I've got my 24 to 200mm lens on the front of the camera, and it's about 20 centimeters away from the bird, which is about 40 centimeters away from this plastic hedge simulation here behind it. And at 24mm, then I get both the bird and the hedge in focus, which is not really what I want to do. Now I've kept all the settings the same, but changed this lens for my 180 to 600mm lens. Now I've had to move the camera a lot further away to actually keep the bird the same size in the frame, but at 180mm, then the hedge starts to go out of focus. Then I did the same thing again, but zoomed out to 600mm, and the hedge has gone even more out of focus. Now it's not completely out of focus because it's still fairly close, so that's the next thing that we're going to look at. I've changed the setup ever so slightly because I want to demonstrate how changing the distance from the subject to the background can really affect how much the background is in focus. Now I've also got the camera quite close to the subject as well, which can also really help, especially when you've got a small distance from camera to subject and a large distance from subject to background. That can really make a big difference to throwing the background out of focus. The distance between the camera and the subject is about 30 centimeters, and the camera is going to remain set to an aperture of 6.3. At the moment, the subject is about 20 centimeters away from the background, and this means that the subject and the background are both sharply in focus. I've moved the background now to 2 meters behind the bird, and already you can see that this has made a massive difference to how much the background has gone out of focus. And what I'm going to do is the same thing again at 4 meters and 6 meters. It's a really common myth that you need a wide open aperture, a small f number, to get a good out of focus background. Where this does actually help, it's not always essential, because what it also does is it means that you get a very shallow depth of field, and this can run the risk of getting the front of the bird in focus and the back of the bird out of focus if you don't really give some consideration to how much depth of field you're going to get. And so I find it really useful to use a depth of field app on my phone just to get an idea of how much depth of field I'm going to get. Now if I talk you through just how much difference this can make, it's really quite illuminating. So I'm going to plug in the values of an f11 at 500mm with a distance from the subject to the camera of 5 meters, and at that settings what I get is a depth of field of 6.11 centimeters. So that's plenty to get the front of the bird and the back of the bird in focus. Now if I do change that to make the aperture slightly wider down to a 6.3, I change nothing else, my depth of field changes to 3.43 centimeters, which is quite small. And if you're watching where you use imperial, it's only just over an inch in the amount of depth of field that you get. And so the front of the bird and the back of the bird stands a very strong chance of being out of focus, and it gets even worse if I change my focal length to 600mm, because now the depth of field goes down to 2.33 centimeters, which is less than an inch, and this is getting worse and worse. Now if I get the camera even closer to the bird and bring it to 3 meters away from the subject, the depth of field becomes almost unusable at 0.76 centimeters, which is less than the width of my fingernail, which is really not very good at all. So you need to give all this consideration when you're taking photographs, so the depth of field app can be really handy. To summarise, getting an out of focus background is a bit of a juggling act between 3 different factors. The first is going to be the aperture. So a large aperture, which is a small f number, will give you a small depth of field, which will ensure that the background is out of focus, but just watch that you can keep all of the subject in focus. The second is the distance from the subject to the background, which can be really vital. And the third is the focal length that you use. Now don't forget that you can use that depth of field calculator just to work out how much depth of field you're going to get. I do hope you found that video useful. I know when I was starting photography, I was mystified by how people managed to get those really clean, blurred, out of focus backgrounds. It seemed a little bit magical, but hopefully this video has demystified some of that, and it should help you to get better photographs. Now if you have enjoyed this video, do let me know down below in the comments, or nip over to my Instagram or Vero account, that's at Oakden Photography. Leave me your comments there, and you can also see lots of my photographs. Now if you like what I do on the channel and want to help support me to make future content like this, then you can leave via the gift shop. That's at Teespring. There I've got a range of merchandise on offer, so head off over there because the purchase really does help me out and it's very much appreciated. But you don't have to spend any money at all to support the channel. You can do that simply by clicking the like, subscribe and the bell notifications. It really helps me out and it makes sure that you don't miss out on any future content. Watch out for next week's video. That goes live on Sunday. In the meantime, you can go and check out this video just up here, but all that's left now is to say stay safe and I'll see you soon.